In today's video, we're diving into the legendary Rousseau Gambit. This wild opening begins with black striking immediately with the shocking move pawn to f5. Let's break down the tricks, traps, and hidden ideas behind this bold choice. Why is the Rousseau Gambit so effective? At first, I dismissed it as a dubious line no serious player would touch. But once I dug deeper, I realized it's far more dangerous and deceptive than it looks. And that's what makes it so powerful. Let's rewind for a moment. After white plays bishop to c4, putting pressure on that active diagonal, black suddenly responds with the shocking move, pawn to f5. At first glance, it looks suicidal. Black gives up a pawn for free, opens the diagonal toward the king, and weakens their whole position. Everything about it screams bad chess, or so I thought. But here's the twist. It's actually incredibly dangerous. It's nearly impossible for white to figure out the right response over the board. Think about it. What would you play here as white? Maybe you'd capture the pawn, maybe you'd defend it with d3 or knight to c3, or perhaps you'd even consider trading on g8 to stop black from castling. Sounds logical, right? Well, all of those moves are wrong. The only correct response is a completely different idea, which we'll look at in a moment. And that's the beauty of the Rousseau Gambit. Even the most natural, instinctive moves can be punished instantly. For example, if white plays knight to c3, defending the pawn, black simply strikes back with d5, hitting both the bishop and the knight, and the game collapses for white on the spot. That's how lethal this opening can be if your opponent underestimates it. Now, of course, there's always the small chance that your opponent has studied the Rousseau Gambit before and comes prepared. But for the rest of the chess world, they're going to be in big trouble. One of the most common questions I get is about the move bishop takes g8. At first glance, this looks like a clever idea for white, forcing black to recapture with the rook so that black cannot castle, leaving the king apparently exposed. It seems dangerous for black, right? Well, in reality, bishop takes g8 is a serious mistake. White is trading their most active and powerful piece, the light-squared bishop, for black's completely passive knight on g8. On top of that, white surrenders control over many key light squares in the center, which only makes it easier for black to see space and begin an attack. Usually, after bishop takes g8, white follows up with pawn takes f5. It looks tempting. Why not grab the free pawn? But this too is another common error. After white captures, black immediately pushes pawn to a4. Suddenly, white realizes too late that their knight on f3 is in deep trouble. The knight cannot retreat to d4 or e5 because those squares are covered by black's knight on c6. It cannot move to h4 or g5 either because those squares are controlled by the black queen. In other words, the knight is trapped, and white's position collapses almost instantly. That's why the move bishop takes g8, while it might look attractive, is actually the start of white's downfall in this opening. In this position, white is left with only one passive option, retreating the knight all the way back to g1. And you can already see how miserable that looks for white. It's as if white has already given up and is just setting up for the next game. That feeling is actually quite accurate, because the position is already very bad for white just a few moves into the opening. Now, there is one little detail you need to watch out for when playing the Rousseau Gambit. Since you pushed your pawn forward to f5, it sometimes gives white the option of bringing the queen out to h5 with check against your king. At first glance, that may seem concerning, but in reality, your position is so strong here that you don't even need to worry about it. Yes, you could play a move like queen to g5 to shut down white's queen and create counterplay, but it's not even necessary. The simplest and strongest plan is just to continue with pawn to d5, taking control of the center, preparing to develop the bishop, and putting pressure on the pawn on f5. In fact, white playing queen to h5 is yet another mistake. Why? Because it only looks like an attack. One of the golden rules of attacking is that the attackers must outnumber the defenders. Here, that rule is completely violated. Black's king is surrounded by defenders, while white has only the queen attacking alone. That kind of attack is doomed to fail. For example, if white plays queen to h5 check, you can calmly respond with pawn to g6. If white trades queens on g6, not only is the attack over, but you actually gain a bonus. Your rook on h8 recaptures and suddenly becomes active on the open g-file. So once again, white's so-called attack simply backfires and helps black improve their position. Often, white will grab the pawn on h7, thinking they're winning material by attacking your rook, but after you calmly play queen to g5, it's already time for white to resign. With this single move, you defend your rook, attack white's queen on f5, and also target the rook on h1. On top of that, there's another hidden threat, rook to h6. Once that rook lifts, white's queen is nearly trapped. Think about it. There are 10 defenders around your king versus one lonely attacker. Of course, the queen is going to get in trouble. In fact, the only escape square is queen takes c7, but after bishop to d6, the queen is captured and the game is over. Now, going back to the main line of the Rousseau Gambit, let's look at the most common move white plays. Pawn takes f5. At first, this seems logical, but it's actually a mistake. By capturing that pawn, white allows your pawn from e7 to advance to e4, kicking away the knight from f3. Most opponents will panic here and retreat the knight all the way back to g1, where it sits completely passive. From there, it's easy for black to dominate the game. However, stronger opponents might try something trickier. Knight to d4. This move looks clever because it offers the knight as bait, hoping that if you capture it, white's queen can jump out to h5 with check. Unlike before, this time the queen would be supported by the bishop on c4, and together they could create real mating threats, possibly even a scholar's mate-style finish. That's why against knight to d4, you need to be precise and avoid giving white this counterplay. Of course, you don't want to allow white's queen to jump to h5, but the solution is very simple. Just play knight to f6. This develops naturally while covering the h5 square, so the threat disappears instantly. Now the knight on d4 is still hanging, so white usually captures on c6. You can recapture with either pawn, but taking with the b-pawn is often stronger in practice. After that, white will often castle, and you reply with pawn to d5, seizing the center and hitting the bishop. Once the bishop retreats, you recapture the pawn on f5 with tempo, developing your bishop at the same time. From here, your position is excellent. If white tries pawn to d3, you calmly develop bishop to d6, pointing directly at white's king. Even if white trades in the center with pawn takes a4, you simply recapture with the knight and maintain strong activity. At this point, nearly all of your pieces are harmoniously developed, both bishops aimed at the king side, the knight controlling key squares, your rook ready to come into play, and your queen prepared to swing to h4. The middle game plan is clear, a direct kingside attack, and because white has already slipped in the opening, they'll be on the defensive from here on out. Now, maybe a computer like Stockfish could defend this position, but for a real human being, it's nearly impossible. In practice, most white players try rook to e1, hoping to pin your knight and maybe prepare pawn to a 3 or something similar. But this move actually backfires because it weakens their castled king. Here's how you punish it. You strike immediately with bishop takes h2, a classic Greek gift-style sacrifice. After white captures with king takes h2, which is forced, you play queen to h4 check. The only move for white is king to g1, but now they pay the price for moving their rook earlier. You continue with queen takes f2, and suddenly white's king is wide open. After king to h2, you can simply castle, bringing your rook into the attack. There's no immediate forced checkmate, but white's position is collapsing. There are no defenders around the king, while black has multiple attackers ready to strike. The attack is overwhelming. To give just one example from the game we're analyzing, after knight to d2, black unleashed the brilliant move bishop to h3, threatening queen takes g2. If white dares to capture the bishop, then queen to g3 is checkmate on the spot. A beautiful finish to a devastating attack, all born from the Rousseau Gambit. Thanks for watching.